sloping. And that continued for many years, and it continued till the 1960s and 70s, when the size of those denominations peaked. And then since then, since roughly the 70s, about the time I came into ministry in 1973 actually, is when these denominations peaked in size. And ever since then, what do you think's been happening? The denominations have declined in size, and consequently, the size of the national staff has declined in size. So every year, there were fewer and fewer of those offices that were filled. Again, just to give you a personal example, because this is the one I know best, when I was ordained in 1973, the Reformed Church in America, which is a little teeny denomination, had 125 national staff members who were housed in that office in New York City. And we were one of the smallest. Today we have about 10. And similar stories for other places. So, but what I would like you to talk about is, first, just your response to what I said, because all three of these, frankly, are viewed by many Christians as very positive things. Constantine accepting Christianity, why wouldn't that be a good thing? Protestant Reformation, well, aren't we Protestants? Institutionalization, the growth, the burgeoning of the mainline denominations after World War II, why would that not be a good thing? So I just kind of like to play devil's advocate, but also get your honest feedback. What do you think about these? Do you think they're good, bad, indifferent, some of both? Don't all rush the mic at once. Yes, Andrea, come on up.
First of all, I don't believe that Constantine became a Christian. I believe that Constantine had a revelation that if he did not usurp Christianity and pull it in, it was going to destroy the Roman Empire. So he did it for political reasons. I have trouble believing he did it from his heart and soul. And then secondly, Luther was just trying to change the Roman Catholic Church, Not really. It started the whole Protestant Reformation, which ended up happening. I don't know whether that's relevant or not, but I'm not even sure of the history of how it became from the
95 Theses.
To turning into the Protestant Reformation, but I guess, so are any of those things positive? I can't answer that. Are they positive or negative? They just are. I think that what the Roman Empire did with Christianity, I have trouble seeing in a lot of ways as being positive, especially with crusades and all those kind of things. But I also, it did help Christianity grow, but not the same as with the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers. I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Those are some of my
and those are all very helpful comments and on target. I'm not, starting with Constantine, I'm not sure if that helped Christianity grow. Certainly, nominally, it did. Because in the course of less than 100 years, you went from being persecuted for being a Christian to being persecuted if you weren't a Christian. Okay? So, virtually all of what we now call Europe became nominally Christian because you would pay a severe price if you didn't. So was that good for the church? So the church can now say we have X tens of millions of members in the church, but how many of those members are really authentically committed to their faith? That would be the question. And the whole point about Constantine and whether that was a genuine, sincere conversion or not, I has been the subject of much speculation forever, and I think the honest answer is people don't really know. And it actually wasn't Constantine who made Christianity the state religion. He converted, and that had a huge impact because the persecution just kind of dropped off, walked away. But it was only 60 or 70 years later that Christianity became the official state religion, and you could now pay a price for that.
Thank you.
Luther, that's a very fair point. And again, I would want to say, I wouldn't want to be perceived as somebody who said the Protestant Reformation was a horrible thing. And you are absolutely right, Andrea. Luther had no idea at all, no intention at all of dividing the church or leaving the church. His goal was to reform the church, and he ultimately was not given that option. He was ultimately excommunicated when he refused to give up his faith or what he believed. It's also interesting that Luther felt very strongly that no church should be named after a human being. It should be named only after Jesus Christ, the Church of Jesus Christ, the United Church of Christ. So, what do we call those tens of millions of people all over the world that follow him? Lutherans. But I think there were some good things about the Reformation, but ultimately it did fracture the church and set a pattern from that point onward where we just fracture and divide over minuscule little stuff that nobody really understands. And it's like we're taking our toys and going home and making our own church. And that clearly has been destructive to the church generally. And I think in the United States that's been destructive as well, because the proliferation of divisiveness does not speak well to the community that is outside the church looking in. Julie, yeah, come on up, please. The idea is that I'll be able to read your lips.
I could go around like this. Play pop theater in the round.
You go wherever you want, Julie.
Such a non-conformist. My comment is on the latter point, the post-World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think the objective was probably good, like forming a United Nations. Because they saw how countries coming together could defeat evil in World War II. But I think it also then became a bit like the United Nations, in that it really just became very bureaucratic, very top-heavy. And I tend to think, too, that if they would have worked with each other, and instead of building their own kingdoms, because what happens is you ended up with silos, right? So then you just had all of these silos. They want to do this, and they want to do this, and they want to do that. And as an aside, one of the things that I had read maybe about 20 years ago to the demise of Christianity, and it wasn't necessarily a mistake, but that after World War I, 95% of people went to church, or before World War I. After World War I. After World War II, 75% of people went to church. And then after Vietnam, it was down to 50%. And they had just really said it was a bit of the hopelessness on why would God do this type of thing. And so I often think if the church would have addressed that at the time, instead of building up its infrastructure, we maybe would be a lot better off. That's my comments.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Other comments? Anna? Julia set the precedent. You can face whoever you want.
I probably
Reformation kind of threw a lot of good stuff out from the Catholic faith. They became much more head-oriented, and John Calvin and his rules and regs and all of that stuff. They really did a number on Mary. I mean, she was chosen, but we have never had much to say about Mary. They threw her out with the bathwater. Just a lot of things that would have been fine to hang on to went. So, yeah. And now the Protestant churches have various degrees of that. The Episcopalians, everybody says, are very close. I became Episcopalian in my early life, and it was quite a switch to go to Reformed Church, which is one of the Calvin derivatives, and it's just real different. We could all learn from each other.
Can you say just a word or two about how different, Episcopal versus Reformed? How are they different?
Okay, there's a mystical bent that for me is lacking. Anybody who's done meditation and prayer and candles and stations of the cross and labyrinth and things like that, they wouldn't dream of doing that. And for some personalities like mine, those are good things. They help you to focus and to get in touch.
Absolutely. So it goes back to that, and again, to varying degrees in various communities. Probably the tradition that I came out of was close to the worst. The Calvinist branch of the Protestant tree was just so totally head dominant. And really room for very little else. One of the things Anna alluded to is throwing away a lot of the good stuff that the Catholic Church embraced and was enriching, and I would totally agree with that. One example is Mary. She's a great example of that. Another one I always find humorous is the Lord's Supper, okay? The Eucharist, the Holy Communion. So, without trying to explain this, the Catholic faith, the Catholic Church, has a doctrine of the Lord's Supper that is called transubstantiation, right? And it's, in a nutshell, it's basically that the bread and the wine literally become the body and blood of Christ in the sacrament, as we celebrate the sacrament, as the priest blesses it. So Martin Luther was a good Roman Catholic for his whole life. And he really didn't disagree with the doctrine of the Lord's Supper, of transubstantiation. But he couldn't stand it that he would have to say that he agreed with them on such an important doctrine. So Luther came up with the doctrine of consubstantiation. Not transubstantiation, but consubstantiation, which is that the bread and the cup do not become the body and blood of Christ, but the body and blood of Christ surround it and are within it, are over it. Pure semantic BS. And then others who couldn't even stand that, and they wanted to distinguish themselves from Luther, other Protestant sects, they say, no, it's the doctrine of the real presence. That Christ is present with us in a meaningful and tangible way as we celebrate the supper, but not specifically in the bread and the cup. So that's called the doctrine of the real presence. And then some others, and my tradition would be one who would say the doctrine of the real presence. Presbyterians, Reformed typically would be in that camp. And then others who wanted to downgrade it even more and separate it even more said, no, it's just a memorial feast. There's no hocus pocus going on here. Nothing fancy. Nothing mystical. We're just remembering. That's all it is. So we come up with 4 doctrines of the sacrament of Holy Communion, mostly just because people want to distinguish themselves from another sect of Christianity. Okay, David, did you have a comment you wanted to make?
Not this time.
Okay. I thought I saw you wagging your hand. Any other comments on those 3 areas that I talked about in my sermon? Let's then take it a little further and ask the question, what else? What else do you see in our history or in our culture? And now let's talk very specifically about mainline Protestant Christianity in the United States. Okay? What other factors do you see either in the history of the church or in the culture around us or whatever that have contributed to this fairly dramatic decline we've seen in the last 50 years or so? Ken, come on up.
One of the huge things I think that's changed is how community businesses operate. When I was growing up, Sundays, most of the places were closed. Nowadays, everything's open on Sunday, and you look at all the parents that have to work on Sundays, and there's no way that they can attend services because they're chasing the American dream.
Thank you, Ken. I think Beth is coming up. Make sure you get yourself on video.
If I could put it in a nutshell, I would say that really, I think the issue with the church is to what extent it's going to accommodate the culture around it. How does it relate to the culture around it? I don't think, it kind of what Ken says kind of gets at that. But on the other hand, how is the church called to respond to diversity? I mean, we can't assume that everyone in the United States is Christian anymore, and I think that's good for us.
Yep.
Part of the reason why the Southern Baptist Convention grew by leaps and bounds is precisely because of schism. So that it's like basic cell replication. And it creates a diversity where more and more people can perhaps find a home within Christianity. I'm a product of metropolitan community churches, and that is a church that was born out of the refusal of the mainline denominations to accept people like me. So I'm not sure where I'm going with this, and I don't feel especially well today anyway, so,
Actually, I'm sorry. I'm not cutting you off.
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, you're kind of leading us into one of the areas that I did want to talk about. So,
I think I'll let you talk about it.
good job, Beth. Yeah, I think Beth is referencing one of the things that has contributed to the church's demise has been, to put it bluntly, it being on the wrong side of a whole lot of social issues for a very long time.
Yes.
So where did the Southern Baptist Church come from? What are its roots? How did it come into being?
Civil war.
Yeah, I mean, they formed during the Civil War because they wanted to make sure that slavery was protected and that the white way of life that they had known for many years was going to be sustained. And there were people in the Northern Baptist churches who were talking crazy things about emancipation and equality. So a whole lot of churches were on the wrong side of a lot of these issues for a very long time. And that, if you're talking about slavery, if you're talking about the role of women, okay? So let's look at the role of women in the church. Sometimes people in the church like to congratulate themselves that we came out from the ordination of women in 1980. Okay, so what's wrong with that picture?
They've been there 100 years. United Church of Christ Congregationalists have been there 100 years.
Right. Okay, but that's a significant exception. And the same, of course, would be said on LGBTQ issues. I don't know the exact year, but certainly the United Church of Christ was a leader in open and affirming and welcoming of LGBTQ people. But in almost all of these instances, whether it's slavery or the role of women or LGBTQ, immigration is another one, vast swaths of the church are on the wrong side of the issue for a very long time. And they either still are, which is the case in some instances, and then they become a bastion for those who are racist or prejudiced or chauvinistic or what the case may be. Or they eventually come around, which is how I would categorize the Reformed Church in America on women's roles. They eventually came around, but they're being followed. They're following the culture. They're not leading the culture. Mm-hmm. We addressed the issue because it was all over the front pages of the newspaper, because feminism was everywhere, and we were forced to take a stand. We weren't leading. We were going along the line. Michael, come on up. Can't do that, Michael. Against the rules. Gotta have rules, Michael. We do things decently and in order here.
Now I forgot what I was going to say. I think I was going to say something about the fact that all these things where the church has been on the wrong side of issues, kind of goes back to the Reformation, and that church is still on the wrong side of a lot of those issues, that particular church. But aside from that, so many people fight these changes within the churches, not necessarily the clergy, but I mean, I've got the indication that a bunch of people left this church when they took on the open and affirming stance. I know a lot of people have left the Presbyterian church that I, my history is with, because they don't like accepting gay people into the church there. And I think a lot of the problems within the church in the last 30 or 40 years has probably had something to do with the rise of the religious right, and the fact that the religious right tends to make a lot of noise and get in the news a lot, and I think it's chased off a lot of more progressive people from churches, and they have a misunderstanding of what churches are. So they just need to look around and find the right church, because there's so many of them.
Yeah, that's a helpful comment, Michael. And I think the United Church of Christ, from what I know of it, has been on the right side of a lot of issues, not universally and not all the time, but much better than most other mainline denominations in terms of speaking for justice and equality as advocates and early on, and not just kind of being dragged in after the culture has made those decisions. I think one of the things that we, the United Church of Christ, and we, this church, don't do a great job of is telling our story. getting the word out, letting people know that not every church believes that. You know, when people come here and visit, they are often very pleasantly surprised and amazed that there's a church like this. I remember conversations when Max first started playing with us, and he and I think he and others had a number of conversations. At that point, when he came on board, I was doing that sermon series, I don't know what it was, 5 or 6 weeks of how to become an anti-racist community. And he was like, wow, this is so great. I didn't know there were churches out there that talked about this stuff. You know? But we don't do a great job of spreading the good news. Okay?
One of the issues in my family is that is science. And this is especially with my kids. You know, they were raised in a church, but there were some social issues, and but the main thing is that they, you know, it's like they cannot see the words in the Bible as metaphorical, you know, because they, you know, you think about the heavens and the sky and the moon, and we've been there and we see what it is. And so there are I think there are a lot of people, maybe who were raised in churches that, you know, they cannot, it causes too much of a conflict in their minds between reality and what churches represent. So just the space thing is a big one, because, you know, you talk about the heavens. And so I think that our nation, you know, because of science education and stuff like that, and what's the first thing to go when you're in a community where they're worried that, you know, God isn't going to be in your community? The first thing that they take out is the science and history, and out of the education, or they modify it. Just for instance, one of my children, we were going to do homeschooling for a while, and when I looked into the books, they were all anti-science, you know, and this was back in the 90s. But I don't think it's gotten any better. There have, you know, the people who want to believe in God, and there are people who want to believe that God created the world in 6 days and then rested on the seventh. And so there are people who cannot see that metaphorically, and on both sides. So anyway, that's what I...
Yeah, thank you. Totally agree. I think the church, well, we still have lots of kids in Sunday school. You know, when we go back 30, 40 years, whatever it was, when we still had lots of kids in Sunday school, they weren't teaching them how to interpret Scripture or how to understand faith in the context of science or faith in the context of culture. They were just, learn the Bible story. This is what the Bible says, with no ability to interpret it or understand how it works in our context. So we had a whole generation of those kids who went to Sunday school, then they got to college, and all the hard questions of life hit them, and they said, you know, we were obviously brainwashed, or it was at least irrelevant. Why would we bother with that stuff? The church that Anna and I went to in Arizona when we lived there, they did not have a large youth program. It was mostly seniors, but they did have 10 or 15 older elementary and junior high and high school kids, and they did a great job of taking on these issues and making sure that they talked about how faith relates to real life and to science, and what we mean when we say the earth was created in 7 days, and what we don't mean, and so forth. So it can be done, but now that the church has figured out what we should do, there are very few kids around. And the kids that are around are not going to churches that talk about this stuff. Gail, come on.
I was just going to address what you just said, Pam, about the curriculums and how difficult it is to find something that's more science related. My daughter decided this last year to, she has, we have she's 3 kids and a foster child. So it's 4 kids to homeschool. I took 2 little ones, but for the older ones, 10 and 12, she spent probably from maybe about April through July or early August searching for a solid homeschooling curriculum because she did not want to rely on the online stuff. She wanted to do the actual hard teaching, with books and classroom style of the kiddos. And it took her months to find one curriculum that was science related and not all the religious stuff. And the way she was able to work with them was, this was a curriculum that they would change it for you. If you wanted the science application, then they would remove all the church stuff. And that it took her months, and it was expensive. It had to be customized for her. But it was, I couldn't believe how hard it was for her to find that. It was all she thought about and all she looked for months, trying to find the right thing for the kiddos. So, good point.
I think Beth is coming back up,
Yeah, just to be brief.
and then Julie.
I think the phrase that we're kind of dancing around is the doctrine of an inerrant Bible. Who needs science when you have an inerrant Bible? I think that biblical inerrancy is the most prevalent form of biblical illiteracy that I know. And probably when the church moved in that direction, I think is every bit as destructive as any other of the things that you listed, David.
What was the word?
Inerrancy. So that every...
Without error.
Without error.
Oh, okay, got it. Okay.
Yeah.
It was dictated by God.
Yeah.
I was sitting here thinking about what is causing a buzz today, term from the 60s or 70s, the buzz in our society. And it's all of this outrage or these feelings about racism, about George Floyd, about how awful the medical system is, the policing, whatever. And it seems to me if somehow the church, and it's not the traditional church, because the traditional church is as far away from that as they could get most of the time, but they could tap into that and harness that, not harness it like exploit it, but that would be kind of a new church, that the principles of Christ that we all believe in here in this church, which then comes into injustice or equality and injustices are, somehow it seems to me that the bigger church really needs to address some of those issues. So.
Thank you. And I think we will call it a wrap. Oh, go ahead, Martha. You haven't spoken, so come on up.
So, David, while I appreciate the 1,500-year division in the way of looking at the history of Christianity, what's helpful to me is to look at the church less from an institutional, organizational perspective and a numbers perspective in terms of the number of people that we've engaged in those organizational structures, and look at the nature of early Christianity. This was a revolutionary movement. This was a countercultural movement. And it was a movement that spoke truth to power. And I don't know how that translates into numbers and organization. But it feels to me like the closer we can get to seeing our role in today's world as being, and this is a scary word, to use the word revolutionary, I know it makes us all think about January 6th. That's not what I'm talking about. But to see ourselves as lifting up the marginalized, as speaking truth to power, as getting close to what it is that Jesus was really talking about when he talked about how do we love each other. And you know, for us, it may mean turning over the baskets. It may mean we have to reevaluate whether we can do that and maintain a building as beautiful as this is, but as expensive as it is to maintain. Or if there are other iterations and other forms in which we can morph. But I kind of think what's happened to the church, whether you look at those 1,500-year marks, almost, is that maybe we take some instruction from Phyllis Tickle, who says every 500 years, the church historically has had a rummage sale. And it's basically turned itself over about every 500 years. And maybe we are in that fermenting time right now, when organizations that call themselves churches and that call themselves Christian may be so far afield from that revolutionary gospel of Jesus that we just need to rethink who it is and what we do. So, you know, I get this great idea and then I just sort of start rambling, but I think I've put out some seeds without really kind of putting it all together. But I think we are on the cusp of something new. And that it may not be about how many of us there are. It may not be about numbers, and it may not be about the success of the institution.
So that was a great comment, number one. Number two, a great setup for next week and where we're going. I would just say, I don't have any doubt in my mind that we're at the cusp of a radical change in what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And next week we're going to talk about what that might look like and how we might move into that, how we would get from here to there. And also to think about this question, and Martha kind of alluded to it, which is, okay, going forward, how do we measure success? What does success look like? How are we going to know whether we're doing the right thing? So think about this week, and, come next week, prepared to have some conversation around that. Okay? Peace. Thank you all.
Sorry, home folks, I was a little late hitting the record button.